Hello and welcome back to Parley, my on-the-spot responses to the prompts you folks submit. This is from Bionicme, hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about this weird mechanic in last epoch, the ward mechanic, it's called. And it's a survivability mechanic that has this interesting effect on player power. It's given to bosses and has this way of kind of metering player damage, equalizing player damage output. And it's also available for players. So it's interesting. There's that kind of parallelism too. So we're going to talk about what it is, what might be working well about it. I think it's really interesting how they're trying to equal out players that do a lot of damage versus less damage, but then some psychological concerns, frankly, with doing that to players. Will players be amenable to this kind of thing since it's very visible? So Bionicme begins. This is a follow-up to my last parlay, where I wanted to highlight the ward mechanic from last epoch, which has a similar function that Overguard does in Warframe, which you talked about a lot in the previous one. You've been doing a series of parlay about survivability. For context, last epoch is a game in the same genre as Diablo or Path of Exile, so these top-down, often a lot of randomly generated stats and loot, lots of enemies that you're killing in a big horde. Very build popping off focused games, not necessarily build making focused, in my opinion, with character classes and a central focus on the grind for random statted equipment. You were ahead of me. Though unlike many games fixated on the RNG grind, my experience with last epoch has been that your ability to squeeze power from the synergies between different skill trees and passives actually has a bigger impact than the plain raw numbers on your gear, at least on the damage output side of things. On the survivability side of things, though, last epoch has a lot of interesting granularity that I'm not going to get into here. But one of the main vectors of survivability available is this ward mechanic, so we're going to start with how it is on players. Yeah, I'll just quickly note that there's a part of me that wants to argue that it doesn't matter that much if more of your power comes from synergies between skill trees, as long as a significant amount of power comes from the random gear. You know, in a way, I almost feel like the skill trees that's what's so bad about these grind focus systems. The skill trees being important and having a big impact is certainly nice, but at the same time, almost nothing matters as long as there is enough power coming from things you just have to grind out. And I feel like that is the downfall, if you don't like that, of most games like this. But it is interesting to hear. Certainly what I played of Path of Exile, I would argue that most of your power, almost all, comes from you grinding out your stuff and getting good gear. It matters what your traits are, your talent tree, the big board of perks, whatever, big skill tree thing, but only in that they enable you to take advantage of very good random gear. So it would be really interesting to see a system like that was more focused on those skill trees being where the power actually comes from, not just an enabler for the power. And I'm sure some people who play Path of Exile would just disagree with what I just said. And by the way, I don't know. I mean, I didn't play that much because I didn't like it that much. But there you go. Yeah, I played like 20 hours, Anyway, sounds cool. Just to say, I also am not that excited to hear that. I feel like it mostly matters if you can get significant power from the random gear, not how much of the total power is from random gear. Pish posh, just because you brought it up. It is interesting here because of what we're going to go on to talk about, though, about how it mitigates player damage output. Though we have to talk about ward as a mechanic in general first, so let's do that. So ward goes on top of your health and takes damage before it, similar to like shields in a lot of games or Overguard in Warframe. And similar to Overguard, characters don't have ward by default, instead gaining it in various ways from various sources, such as, perks you'd be familiar with if you've played this kind of game, as something like ward on hit from a skill, chance for ward on kill from a passive, or ward per second from equipment. Ward doesn't have the crowd control immunity effect of Overguard or anything like that, but also doesn't have a hard upper limit. Instead, this is a key factor for ward that we're going to talk about a lot in this parlay. Ward has a built-in self-balancing aspect where it decays down to 0 over time exponentially faster the more of it you have. So if you have, 10,000 ward, the ward you lose per second is much, much, much higher, several orders of magnitude higher than if you had, let's say, 100 ward. So the result of this is that if you get a huge amount of ward, you won't have very much for long, but you will have some for a long time, as it sort of exponentially decays how it decays, I guess. Interesting. So this decay rate can be modified in multiple ways as well, such as with a flat increase to the decay minimum, which makes it stop before 0, so you'll have a little left at the end, or the aforementioned ward per second, which will work at full efficiency up to that modifiable minimum limit, and after that get increasingly weaker until it reaches an equilibrium point with the decay rate. Oh, when I first read this parlay, I actually paused to make sure I understood that. I'm not always the best abstract thinker on the spot. Imagine you have a ward minimum of 100, and you have 150 ward per second. Well, you will have 100 ward all the time, unless you take damage. But you won't have 150 ward all the time because your minimum ward is 100. You have 150 ward per second, but the ward is decaying except when it's below 100. So you will have between 100 and 150 ward in that situation. So it sounds to me like a mixture of minimum ward and ward per second is going to be the most effective in most cases, though not extremely effective. Ward minimum will get better the more you have of both, because if you get more ward per second when you have a lot of both, the decay rate will be higher. I would assume, let's say you have 1,000 ward minimum and you have 1,500 ward per second. You have a decay rate as if you had 1,500 ward, not 500. You see what I mean? No? Okay, good talk. But anyway, I think that means you want a mix of both, and the more of both you have, the better ward minimum gets and the relatively worse ward per second gets, because you have a lot of ward and therefore it gets kind of taxed. So that's pretty interesting. We can already see how it's a unique mechanic in that it's kind of a separate multiplier set for your survivability. You can have this generating shield buffer thing, or generating health, basically. But if you stack a lot of it, that's effective, but only to a point. Like, it gets less, I guess, multipliery to stack both of the effects a lot. It's very effective if you mix a modest amount of each one, but then once you mix a lot of each one, it starts to fall off, because having ward over your minimum starts to become unfeasible. It'll decay too fast. So that's already very interesting. That's not even what this parlay is really about. That's cool. We could just do, by the way, we should just do the whole parlay about that. Anyway, that's not what you asked for. The intelligence stat in the game also inherently gives a bit of ward retention that slows the decay rate, okay, meaning that naturally intelligence-aligned mage and acolyte classes also naturally lean a bit more into ward because they're squishier, so that kind of makes sense. This also lends itself to some interesting unique item designs, like an armor piece that makes you trade a percentage of your current health per second for a percentage of your maximum health as ward per second, allowing relatively safe access to effects that work best while at low health. I'm sure you can imagine such mechanics being the purview of an acolyte class. Sure, so if you want something that wants you to be at low health for a long time, you can use this effect and it will make your health low, but in doing so give you a big buffer of ward, and then you can hide that low health kind of under the ward. But at the same time, I would hope or imagine there's a skill element where when you have a lot of ward, it decays quickly. So you still want to time when you generate your ward to soak up big attacks, but you always have a buffer of some amount. You need to get it close, but not ridiculously close. If you see an enemy attack coming, it's almost like a really slow parry, if you want to think of it that way. You want to generate a lot of ward to soak up the hit, but it doesn't matter too much exactly when you generate it. You just want it to be soon before the attack happens so that it hasn't decayed too much by the time the attack hits. So cool. That I'm not sure if the game is actually like that. I haven't played this, but that already very cool. What really makes the ward mechanic an interesting mirror to Overguard, though, Bionicme continues, is that similarly to Warframe's issues with players locking down and blasting through Eximus units, the more challenging elite units in the game, without engaging much with them, Last Epochs saw strong players blasting through its bosses with concerning speed. But, whereas Warframe invented Overguard, coupled with crowd control immunity, to solve the problem and later allowed players to access it, Last Epoch repurposed its existing ward system for players, and rebalanced it for bosses to use, and the game is also much less generous with hard crowd control. When a boss loses a certain amount of health, ranging from like half for mini-bosses to about a fifth for major bosses, they will gain a large percentage of their maximum health as ward, which then decays initially slowly but speeds up significantly over time. This makes for an effective cushion in the blazing path of high damage players, whereas while simultaneously not leaving players with weaker builds to slowly chip away at a brick wall of a boss. So, okay, this game is using that mechanic for bosses, and it's sort of like bosses have a phase change, you know, the second phase of a boss, you think of that mechanic in games, where they get a big chunk of ward. And then this is it would be considered beneficial because it creates this equalizing mechanic for player damage. Let's imagine an example I'm going to use a lot throughout this parlay, where we have a boss where we're going to say it's just at half health. The boss has basically 3 phases, if you want to think of it that way. Their first half of their health, once you get them down to that, they trigger their big chunk of ward. Let's say that's another phase. And then the second half of their health, and then they die. So you get them to half, they get a ton of ward, you get through the ward, and then you kill the rest of their HP. So what this has done, compared to having just 2 phases, is that one of the 3 parts of the fight has a sort of damage equalization property now, where if you have a lot of damage, you can make that part of the fight go faster because you damage the ward quicker, right? You do more damage, and so obviously you will empty the ward health bar, as it were, faster. But if you don't have a lot of damage, eventually the decay will kind of do the damage for you, basically. And so that third of the fight, players that have a lot more damage will clear less quickly than players who have less damage. If you don't have a lot of damage, that fight kind of automatically ends after a certain amount of time, that part of the fight. Whereas the other parts, you know, sure, you have to empty the health. So this creates a sort of cushion where that enemy is now less variably going to die in a certain amount of time, depending on how much the player's damage is. If the player does way more damage, they do twice as much damage as another player, the boss will not die twice as fast. They'll die a little bit less than twice as fast because of the chunk of ward. The player who does less damage will kill the boss not with twice as much time. They won't need twice as much time. They'll need a little less than twice as much time because the ward part of the boss is going to kill itself, basically, a little bit for them and make up for their damage. Additionally, because the player who has more damage is killing the ward, the benefit of the decay is sort of removed. The more damage they have, the more the ward decaying on its own won't matter that much. Whereas for the player with less damage, the less damage they have, the more relative like DPS they're gaining during the ward phase because it decays on its own. So the less adequate their damage would have been for that part, the more the ward decaying on its own is like basically boosting their total damage for the fight on average. Interesting. And certainly you can imagine if that doesn't sound like a huge deal, you know, okay, that equalizes it a little bit, but is that really a big deal? Well, remember that Bionicme says that for some bosses, this happens when the boss loses a fifth of its health. If that means that this happens 5 times for major bosses, then there are 10-ish, 9 phases, and 4 of them are the ward phase. And so you can see that adds up quite a bit more, you know, that a lot of the fight is the ward decay is having an effect on how quickly you clear it. For the sake of discussion, I think it would be useful to generate a sort of theoretical number of how much this equalizes the fight. So I'm going to say, let's say it's something like 50%. During the ward phases of a fight, let's assume that players who do, let's say, double the damage, lose about half of the benefit of that damage, or players who do less damage gain about 50% of the power that you could have gotten from doing a ton of damage. So those phases are equalized by 50%, if you will. Now there's still 3 phases if it's a mini boss or whatever, or 9 or whatever it was for a major boss. So that doesn't equalize the whole fight by 50%, but the longer the fight is, the more it will even things out. Cool. To conclude Bionicme's parlay prompt, and then we'll get into it, I find these dynamically self-balancing mechanics of ward to be, as the prompt title suggests, quite elegant in their design. However, I don't think I would say that Warframe or some other game could implement something similar for its overguard or shield mechanics or bosses without making other significant changes. I know you didn't quite agree that the raw numbers of Overguard were the issue with it. Yes, in the previous parlay, I said I don't totally agree that it's just the raw amount of Overguard that makes that mechanic questionable for players. But I'm still curious to hear your thoughts on Ward as a contrast, as well as a mechanic of its own. Sure. Yeah, and I'm interested to discuss them. I'm honestly equally interested in it as a mechanic for players, but I'll focus on the dynamically self-balancing thing. That's what you've asked for. Just to say, I think there's an interesting parlay in here that is about player-owned Ward as well, and we will talk about it a little bit when we talk about psychological concerns for including this in a game. So yeah, we're going to talk about the game design implications of should you do this? You have a game that has a problem like this. Ought you to include this thing? Why or why not? Let's talk about what it's doing a little bit more first. So the effect here is that players will clear bosses in more similar amounts of time. Why is that good? I think it's completely reasonable to ask. Why though? Players like it when they get the power that the game is encouraging them to grind for, and then they benefit from that power. So why is it good to take that away? And you might say, well, it's equitable. Maybe that's a word to use here. It's not equal, but it's equitable. The people that are more in need, the players with less damage, get some help, if you want to think of it that way. I personally do not think this is a good argument in defense of this mechanic. I think there are some good ones that I'll tell you, but I don't think that is one of them. I personally think that if it would be unpleasant to not have enough damage for the enemy, it makes sense to have it be that players just won't lack that damage. You could equalize player damage instead. And you could totally do this. You could make players gain significant damage from a build system, but not have lower than a minimum amount of damage. That is not even that hard, really. That's very possible. You can do that. Warframe actually happens to be a really good example, but a lot of games like this, many games that have a lot of build system space, many different options to pick, have this problem where, well, you can get a lot of multipliers. And so in Warframe, there's this really interesting phenomenon where weapons do very little of their total possible damage themselves. A weapon with no mods, basically any weapon with no mods, is virtually worthless at like any meaningful level of difficulty, and gains like 20 times its base damage from modding. Now, the game is balanced for that amount of damage. Like, that's fine. You get that 20 times amount of damage or whatever, and then it's okay. But the weapons are so little of your total damage. It's almost all coming from your mod multiplying them. And this means that players that don't have those mods, the gap in damage between a player that has like the multi-shot mod for a given type of weapon versus a player who doesn't is the player who has that one mod does double everything. Right, just like that. They have that one drop, like you're doing a mission and you get split chamber as a drop, the multi-shot mod for rifles. Use all of your rifles for the rest of the time playing, straight up just do double of everything. Just like that. I think some people who play Warframe don't understand how amazing, I mean, how unhinged that is. That's insane. You can get a drop that literally just says every single weapon of this type for the rest of your time playing does 2 times everything that it does. Everything that comes out of the gun is doubled. What? And then there are 7 more drops like that. There's 8 mod slots on guns in Warframe. So there's like half a dozen more things you can get as a drop that say something to the effect of, oh, all your damage with this weapon type is doubled or tripled. Also on top of all of the damage that it already did, like also including those other doublings or triplings that you already have. And the result is that a player who plays, around your, I don't know, maybe 20th or 30th hour of Warframe, there will be a span of only a few hours of play where your damage will be multiplied by like 10 for the rest of your time playing. And you will very quickly annihilate all of the content in front of you once you can level up those mods and rocket into higher difficulties. That's weird. I think bad, mostly bad. I think if you just made the mods give half value, they would still have an enormous impact on player damage. But the weapons would not be completely worthless against any meaningful enemies without a ton of mods, and it would be that the growth curve of player power would be more smooth, smooth at all. Let's say not more smooth is an understatement. So I think that compared to that, you can see that having a situation where, oh, the game meters player damage a little bit on the enemy side, enemies kind of equalize some of the player's damage output. Okay, that maybe that doesn't sound as crazy in the light of how some other games do it. I don't think that's so bad. But I feel like that is the example of, okay, but that's just because those other designs are kind of janky. That on its own isn't a reason why doing it this way is good. You can fairly easily make most games give the player more base power, but still keep build systems relevant. And if they've never been a different way before, players won't notice. Obviously, if you retroactively changed a game like Warframe to have the scaling I just described, people would riot and be upset because they're familiar with getting the amount of power they got. They think all their stuff has been nerfed because people are silly about game design. And if they give you the same amount of damage, it doesn't matter that your mod card now says 45% instead of 90% damage, but you know that the general public is not going to be happy with that, right? Obviously, that people won't like that. Will think they won't like that, even though it won't make any difference. And making a build still makes a big difference in that case. More now in a way, because in that situation, a build that is a little bit better than another build would matter less. So in another way, it's good for build variety if you do that. It's good in general, in my opinion, to make it so builds have just enough impact that the decisions feel meaningful without making them have excess impact. That's bad. It's not good for build systems to have like just the most possible impact, as much impact as possible. That's not desirable. That I don't think that is good in games. It's not very hard to make it so builds are still important. It reminds me a little bit of the thing I was saying at the top of the parlay about you said that in Last Epoch the skill trees and synergies have a bigger impact than the plain raw numbers on your gear. And I said, I feel like it only really matters that the plain raw numbers on your gear matter enough to make a difference. And I would argue it's the same thing, the flip side here. It really only matters that your build has enough impact to cause you to win or lose. And having it have way more impact than that is not necessarily good, in my opinion. Not only because it deprivileges players that don't have some involved build planned. That's fine, but you can make a game about making builds, that's fine. The other thing is it makes the build system better because it makes it less relevant to have, if the two options are very close in power level, it says they're basically the same, it's fine. Whereas if you give the player 20 times damage, a small difference in effectiveness can become significant in a way that humans don't think of. Basically, like it won't feel intuitive that that actually makes a difference, but it will. And I think that's bad. Yeah, okay. Basically, I don't think that making it so players that don't have a lot of damage everything is more equal is necessarily that good of an argument for putting ward on all these bosses. You could just equalize player damage on the player side, and that would have other benefits as well. I think it generally is a good idea to do that. So it's not clear that just because of that, like, equitable aspect of making bosses get a ton of ward, this is good. I don't think that's enough. We need some more substantial benefits. Well, one that I think is actually pretty important is the idea that boss fights are often more fun when they're a certain length. We talk about this a lot when we've played Elden Ring on the stream. This idea that for a game where you kind of do the dance with an enemy, boss fights in general, it's not completely subjective what difficulty level is fun to people. There's a way in which you can argue that getting one-shotted in many of these games' designs is just worse than getting, let's say, two-shotted, two or three-shotted. In a lot of Souls-likes, for example, a core mechanic is that when you take damage, you want to drink a flask and heal, but the enemies are programmed to watch for this and go for an attack that will interrupt you when you try to heal. If you panic flask, as people might say, when you take damage, you immediately try to heal it back up, you will almost always die. The game is programmed to almost always reliably kill you if that happens, unless you like get a lot of space or whatever. What is better to do is to live in that tension for a sec. Very exciting and stressful. and dodge an enemy attack, but then instead of using that opening to go in for a hit, you use that opening to drink the flask. And this is a core part of the game's appeal. It creates a tension that is meant to be fun and exciting because you do not get one-shotted. If you get one-shotted, that mechanic is deleted and is not part of the game anymore. So I would reckon that according to the game's design, it is basically always worse if the enemy one-shots you. Now, one-shotting a player could arguably still have some purpose in the design. You know, this area is too high level or whatever. But if you can create systems that make it so the game's design is working more of the time, that is good, in theory. And it's the same for bosses. On the other hand, the player killing a boss too fast or too slow is somewhat objectifiably just worse than them killing them at like a certain speed. And it doesn't have to be a very exact speed. That's the thing about doing big chunks of player damage to the player. The player doesn't need to have a very specific amount of health to not get one-shotted if the goal is for them to get 2 or 3-shotted, which I would argue it is in those games. Because let's say the player has 500 health and the boss does 300 damage to them per hit. Well, they'll die in 2 hits, but they overkill by 100 with the second hit. So if the player had 580 health instead of 500, they still die in 2 hits. The design works the same way. You can see it's kind of squishy. If the player had 400 health, they still die in 2 hits, not 1. This is good because it means that the exact amount of health the player has is not extremely important. The design will still reliably work at a wide range of player health. It just has to be in the ballpark of the right area. This is really good for scaling because it means you can gain players advantages. They can gain stats and get more powerful without breaking the design just because they got 1 more HP. Almost all of the time, anyway. And if the boss does some attacks that, you know, are faster but do a little less damage, that will equalize health further. And you can do this to bosses as well. You can hopefully see where we're going. Having a boss that has a sort of buffer, a kind of speed limit, if you want to think of it, when they get their big block of ward during phase 2, creates a situation where the fight will more reliably last an amount of time where, you know, the boss's attacks or mechanics will happen or be fun. The boss does a phase where they do a rain of fire and meteors fall from the sky and hit elsewhere on the field, and you're meant to avoid them while still damaging the boss, maybe during its ward phase. Well, the ward block helps make it so that that mechanic will actually happen, even if the player has a ton of damage. And if the player doesn't have a lot of damage, that mechanic will end without them doing a ton of damage. I think that's pretty good. Yeah, that's a good reason to do this. It means that fights can be reliably a certain length, and they won't be way too long or way too short for some of the fight, but it doesn't feel overly artificial. It kind of feels like the enemy just has a defense measure that you're familiar with, and the player has it too. I think that's a big deal. We'll get back to that in the psychological part, where, yeah, things even out a little bit there. I think that is a good argument for this mechanic. Now, I haven't played this game, and so I don't know, like, but do they actually use this mechanic that way? Is this big chunk of ward actually used to make the boss fights basically more fun, is the argument I'm making here, by ensuring that they are the length that you can somewhat objectify basically just is better. It just is more fun if the boss fight is around this length range. Is that actually what the ward mechanic is doing in this game? I don't know, and it doesn't matter. We're talking about this as a game design idea. This specific game no longer matters. But I hope it does. I think that's cool. Certainly, I've played a lot of boss fights in Elden Ring where I would have preferred it to have been that way. You know, like that wasn't a thing, and I think it would be a lot better if it was, I guess. Cool, neat. And could that be enough of a reason by itself? Sure. Unless players get incredibly upset when you do it. Let's see if that is what happens, the psychological portion. So obviously telling players that they have more damage, they did better in this meritocracy, late capitalism nightmare that we live in, is going to make people pissed off to an extent. When people realize that they're being like punished for their damage output a little bit, or it's being taken away from them a little, that feels unfair. Humans care about this a lot. I believe it's often underestimated just how much. I think most people intuitively know, people probably won't like that much. But for real, we're so petty. Like, human beings are extremely petty in this kind of instinctual way that is hard to learn yourself out of. I've certainly been chipping away at it, but I can't claim to be doing that well. Where our monkey brains just see the inequality and that's not right. As ironic, of course, because it's sort of unequal to begin with. Like, humanity is so full of inequality in ways we celebrate. People having different abilities that other people don't, though they perhaps could have them, is something that people see as good, but then get pissed off whenever it affects them, sort of. So I think it's a funny phenomenon here. There's not a ton you can do. And I think a fair opening argument against worrying about this is, look, there's a benefit to the design. You can make boss fights reliably happen in the time interval that will be fun. The boss gets to do its mechanic, you get to enjoy the fun boss mechanic, but it doesn't last forever or just like punish you for not being exactly the right amount of damage or whatever, the right level. But you also don't blast through it. If you have a lot of damage, you get the benefit of that damage. You do kill the boss significantly faster, but there's a way the game can guarantee that you still get to fight the boss. You still get to do the boss mechanics. That seems good. And you can't do anything about human petty over caring about equality when that doesn't even really exist. And so who cares? It doesn't really matter, you know? All right, yeah, you know, and as with the section before, I don't necessarily think that's a great argument, but unfortunately, I think there are some issues that actually matter that we do still need to talk about. That's not good enough. You can't just say the homework is done because I checked for 1 second. There's one bad argument for it being a psychological issue, so we're good. Put Ward in every game. You know, no, I don't think that's enough. There are some actual issues, in my opinion. Not huge issues. It's still a cool mechanic, but some concerns. Yeah, one of them is that it can be gamey, basically. There's a risk that it will be gamed. Now, I think this system is better at avoiding that in a lot of ways. I recall a system that I've heard about in another game where basically the enemies dynamically scale to how accurate you are. It's a first-person shooter. And if you are more accurate and do more damage, the enemies like get better at avoiding you or doing more damage to you. And so the difficulty sort of dynamically reacts like that. Now, of course, you can see there's a problem. They were probably thinking that you can hide that because the game is a first-person shooter. You don't have to have as much of an emphasis on enemy health bars. A lot of those games don't. This game doesn't. I don't remember this game, but I'm remembering this footage in my mind. So there aren't visible health bars. So you can't see the enemies necessarily like being more tanky in the same way. I think they were hoping that players just wouldn't notice that the game is adapting to it, but we live in the 21st century, and that's not really a thing anymore. Social media will pick up on this like that, and then anybody with any connection to the internet at all, way more people than the number of people who would like engage on the Reddit for the game or whatever. Way more people than that. Not maybe 10% of the audience, let's say, might be the Reddit, but more like 50% of the audience, those that don't live under a rock and get any news about the games industry, who play video games. That's just a guess, but I think a lot more people will hear about like, oh, this game dynamically adjusts difficulty. And then at that moment, it's broken because those players will then know, a lot of players will think, well, if I do better, the enemies punish me by killing me more. So I'm going to start to try to play around that a little. Or if I'm having trouble, I'll purposefully, for example, shoot the ground to tank the game's recording of my accuracy to dynamically make enemies weaker, and then I'll just quickly kill them all and then shoot the ground again to remove that like goodness from the system. And it's very gameable. Now, I purposefully used an example where it's kind of easy to game. You don't have to be very smart or attentive to go, the enemies get better when I shoot better, therefore I will deliberately shoot as badly as possible to make them bad, kill them all, and then deliberately shoot as badly as possible to remove the benefit of that good play I just did to game the system and be more effective. Quick pause for a detour that I think Bionicme probably doesn't want me to take that much, but I think is important to at least acknowledge, which is that people will here argue that you ought to just not play the game that way. The game shouldn't bend over backwards for players that play it in a way that is unfun. I do not accept this argument. I think it is only fair to say that the game is the behavior the game rewards, and you can't just say, well, you can play the game in a way where you ignore what's effective and rewarded by the game because it could be more fun that way if you can forget about those things. Okay, I mean, sure, but it is still a fair criticism of the system that it encourages the player to do that. It does encourage the player to do that. It's not invalid if a player says they enjoy that game because they were able to just not game that mechanic. Fine, very well, that's great. That's great for that player. But it is still a valid criticism of the system that it is so easy to take advantage. It would obviously be better if it wasn't easy to take advantage of, right? And so, yeah, it's relevant if you can play a game like that in a way where you don't break it by gaming the system, but I don't think that that is then a valid defense of doing the system that way. Sure, it's great that you can have fun that way, but that's a good thing about those players. It would still be better in every way if you couldn't game the system. So it's still fair to critique that point. When people say this idea that, oh, but you could just play the game not that way, it's good to acknowledge that what they're doing is being defensive. They're saying, I enjoyed the game and you're taking that away from me. You're attacking my enjoyment of the game. And so I'm going to defend it by saying that you're just playing the game wrong. But no one actually is attacking the way they're playing the game. They did enjoy the game that way. That's real and valid and good and whatever. Honestly, irrelevant. It doesn't matter. We're talking about the game by itself, not their experience of it. So that's relevant, but I don't think it's a good defense of those systems. It would still be better in every way. It's still worth pursuing to make a system like that that isn't gameable. And I think that this ward mechanic is a decent approach at that. For one thing, I actually think it's good that it's visible. After all, part of the problem that I had with that shooting example I just gave is that the game thinks it's going to get away with it because you can't see directly the health bar going up or whatever. It's enemy AI getting better at attacking you, and so they're thinking like, oh, maybe players just won't notice. But part of my argument of why that's futile is that it's the 21st century. They're just going to be told. And so the first step for any dynamic scaling, in my opinion, is there's no need to try to hide it because you can't hide it. It's the 21st century. There's no hiding it. I would be interested to see someone try to win that Darwin Award. Maybe if you go really crazy, you could nuclear escalate and find a way to really hide that type of system. I guess I'm sure you could. I guess my point is just, while it doesn't solve the problem, it's a good first step that the system isn't trying to hide that it dynamically adapts to players. You wouldn't have been able to hide it anyway. So if the system is visible, that's a good sign that maybe it's going to be okay. They didn't think it would be okay simply because players won't know, which is futile. Okay. The second thing, it doesn't equalize all gameplay. So remember our mini boss. Phase 1, the normal health, you get the boss to half health. Phase 2, they get their big chunk award, you empty that out. Phase 3, their second half of their health. Okay, so for phases 1 and 3, there's no equalization. The boss fight is the same for everybody, and if you have more damage, you gain the benefit of all of that additional damage. There you go. So this is one element where the player gets to experience non-equalization, but there also is a part of the fight that equalizes for the player. I think this is a pretty big deal. I don't know, but I think psychologically people would really care about that. It benefits people to feel like there are parts of the game where me being more powerful doesn't matter, but I get the feeling of the full benefit of being more powerful for other parts of the game. That might seem silly, but all of this is silly anyway. It's good for the boss fights to equalize depending on player power level. It's just frustrating for our simian brain sense of equality, right? It's okay to trick this away because caring about it is kind of a trick in the first place. So it's completely okay for it to be, oh, that's kind of an insubstantive difference. Fine. That I think that's okay. You just have to make it feel within reason like there are parts where you see the full benefit of your damage. Again, I think it's a good sign for this type of system if you can just tell people and it still works. The way I would test such a system would be to thoroughly explain this to all of the playtesters and then let them play it. Not hide it at all. Aggressively put it out in the open and then see what they think. And point out to them that you're doing your full damage during these phases, but there is this one phase where, the boss is doing its AoE fire rain attack or whatever meteor rain attack I made up before. And during that phase, there is this equalizing mechanic where players will do relatively similar damage. You'll still kill it faster if you have more damage, but, it equalizes it a bit. Directly tell players that. Do not try to hide it. Do not say, but like you're still better off if you have more damage. Like try to admit, if you will, that it is just taking away some of the player's power for that phase. And to me, that's a better litmus test anyway. For it should feel okay, even if you just directly tell players that. It should be that psychologically, seeing it be that the you do your full damage for some other parts of the fight needs to be enough. And if it isn't, I would pursue a different method. So the game does visually do this. So that's an okay sign that perhaps if this game it remains popular, then that's not a huge psychological issue for a lot of players. Okay, sure, that's something. Great. Another thing is the equality of both the player and the enemy getting ward. Now, I'm not sure if I've understood this correctly, Bionicme, but it sounds to me like it doesn't work exactly the same way for the player and the enemy. The enemy has their ward decay slower at first and then faster over time, whereas the player has their ward decay more the more of it they have. And those are sort of opposite, close to being opposites anyway, if I'm understanding correctly. If I'm not, I'm sorry. I'll try to make the example matter either way. I do think that the appearance of this little overshield thing, I'm imagining your red health bar and then you've got a, white or blue sort of shield block over it, the ward mechanic in this game. And the fact that the player sees that on their health bar and then the enemy has that on their health bar, I believe does have significant psychological weight. I think that that means something to our, again, kind of stupid and not real sense of inequality about these things. It's not really equal, obviously. If you think about the boss, doing their AoE meteor rain attack and the player, they're obviously not actually equal. And the player doesn't get a big buffer of ward when they go to half health, like a boss phase, though doing it that way might be a pretty cool mechanic. You get kind of incidental one-shot protection in the game, as we talked about in previous Parley. Huh? Anyway, that's not what the game is like as far as I can tell. You could make it more equal, and I think that would be better in some ways. But the very fact that you can see that mechanic on both you and the boss does have some psychological weight, in my opinion. And so that means there's a better chance the player will accept that basically the idea is it's only fair that both you and the boss get this defense. You get this defense, so the boss can have it too, and that seems reasonable, maybe. This one may allow players to just focus less on the inequality. People aren't going to be able to let go of the idea of inequality easily if they focus on it enough, no matter how fair it feels a lot of the time. So there is still some merit to not dwelling and fixating on that inequality. And so just making it look more equal. I mean, it is more equal. The player has access to this form of survivability in some form as well. Does help. I think that has real value. Again, it would go a long way for players to have it be more equal, like the player as well, or normal enemies as well, get a big chunk of ward when they hit half health. I think that would make this effect would be even better if you did that. But I feel like this does matter. The player won't fixate on it. And then the previous point was it is equal some of the time. Even though that feels kind of artificial, I feel like that does matter too. These things take pressure off of, that's basically what we're doing here, taking psychological pressure off of the inequality that exists, where the ward mechanic makes players that do more damage do less more damage for some of the time, taking away some of the power that they earned, they feel like. We're psychologically trying to release some of the pressure on that, literally PSI, pressure pushing down on, compressing that idea and making it stick in people's minds. And I reckon that those are probably two rather effective ways to do it, sure. Pretty interesting. And in many ways, I feel like this is insightful. I worry that they didn't actually think that much about player equality, and sometimes I think games that have these systems kind of just got lucky, forgive me for saying it that way. They had the conscious thought to equalize player damage, but they really didn't think about the psychological consequences at all, and most games do this and do it badly. Okay, so they didn't think about it at all, maybe, or they thought about it badly. And then some games do it well. Did they do a bunch of psychology, or did they just kind of do it and it ended up being that the system they have is relatively equal to humans? I think that very few game developers are focused on the psychological angle of their games, and that it is a huge unsung it basically is making games. Game design is psychology plus like some game theory related stuff. And that this is a massively undersung part of game design. There's a sort of part of me that feels like for many games, the explanation of their weirdness is that they essentially do not have game designers in the strictest sense of the word. They have game developers, but people who kind of make the game be like a coherent, reliable for humans to enjoy experience basically don't exist. There aren't people that are doing that. They're trying to make something they would like, maybe, and they are a human, so it will correlate with something that humans would enjoy, but they're not specifically trying to engineer something that a human will reliably like. But you can do that, and it's not that hard to do that. It's just something the industry isn't, I just don't think is attempting to do that. As always, I'll say, this is not meant to be a bash toward the games industry. I feel like most game developers, game designers are smart and would be able to do this easily if they tried. That's actually why I think that they're not trying, because I have every confidence that people smarter than me would be able to figure this out if they thought it was relevant, but I think they don't think it's relevant. I don't know. One more quick comment to make. There's a lot of straw man arguments that in a previous draft of this parlay I talked about more, but I feel like they're worth acknowledging. You know, you could assume that the ward mechanic you could make the ward mechanic for bosses balanced in such a way that players that do more damage literally don't kill the boss faster, like kill the boss negligibly faster. We have to assume for the sake of discussion, and I have been for this whole parlay, I just think it's worth acknowledging at the end for any hangers on to that issue, that we assume that the ward mechanic is balanced in a sane way. Obviously, it's stupid if players that do way more damage kill the boss insignificantly faster. Obviously, that's bad. So let's not critique that obviously bad version of that. There's no need to discuss that. That's not good. Don't do it that way. Moving on. And so I did, but I still feel like it's worth mentioning here. I guess I should have put this earlier in the parlay, but whatever. For the kind of person fixated on that argument, this wasn't going to be a good parlay anyway, so go figure. And then a little bit more important, I think it's also worth assuming, but it's still worth clocking, that you could make the ward mechanic in such a way where it is a valid tactic to stall. For example, if you can become tanky enough that you can just AFK through the ward, well, it empties itself on its own. So let's add a third player. One player has less damage, one player has more. We talked about those for a while. The third player is going to do something a little weird. They have okay damage, sure. They beat phase 1, the boss gets a ton of ward, now they have a very tanky build. They AFK and go make a sandwich during phase 2. And they have a build such that they do not die during that time. This is possible in this theoretical example. They beat the boss faster in terms of active playtime. The amount of time they have to actually operate the game is the lowest of all three players, even though they undeniably did the lowest damage per second, because the ward does eventually go away on its own, and they simply didn't play the game for that period of time, or like only dodged while paying attention to something else. They made use of their time in a different way. Again, this is a case where I think it's fair to argue the game is the behavior the game rewards. If you can get that time back for something else too easily, I think that's an issue. But I think it's worth, for the sake of argument, assuming that isn't the case in Last Epoch. I'm just saying, if you were to put this in another game, one thing you'd want to look out for is to make sure you can't just like ignore the ward phase, because it does end on its own. If the ward decays on its own, you probably need to make that part of the game like very challenging. That's why I said the boss does this meteor rain attack. Just do something like that. Make that part of the fight hard. And another good thing about that is it equalizes things more. In many games, your DPS will go down if the fight is more demanding. You have to avoid stuff and focus on doing your perfect damage less. And so that will also further equalize player effectiveness. But that is an important ingredient. This likely won't work well as a way to equalize things if you can just ignore the ward phase of the fight and go do something else, because the boss does eventually literally kill itself through that phase. And so that, again, that might seem a little silly, but you can just see now, if 10 game developers copy this thing we suggested here, in one of those games, you're going to be able to do what I just said. So I'm sorry, not sorry. It's parlay. I don't know. Like, we're supposed to include this stuff. Very cool topic. I'm really enjoying this survivability series because I think it's done in a sort of half-baked way. I feel like there's developments to be made. You've had some really good ones so far. I like this series. Again, I think it would be cool to do a thing about player ward / player survivability, but we did already do some about one-shot protection, which I thought those were also pretty good. So yeah, anyway, I'm looking forward to where you go next with these. Folks, if you'd like your own parlay like this one, you can get those using a link in the description. You can sign up and post whatever you want every month. I even post a few little prompts of my own that you can use to bounce off of. If you want a little podcast that furthers your own interests, where I chew on an idea you're interested in, but you're not sure exactly what you want that idea to be, and you want some inspiration. One thing I really like about Parley is that everyone can see everyone's prompts. Anyway, looking forward to the next one.